Chapter 34 of Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea. Chapter 34. Finally, my brethren, be strong. Ephesians 6 verse 10. The younger men were still inclined to rebel. They felt that they were in great numbers, and that they were strong. They believed, with that optimism of excited youth, that their will must prevail in the end. In their opinion, the Caesar had done nothing to atone for his crime against the Prefect of Rome, or for his dastardly cringing before the power of his people. But the older men, those who had mayhap more than once witnessed street rioting and the bloody reprisals that invariably followed upon rebellion, they counselled prudence, an acceptance of what had come about, since the imperial decree had been fixed to the rostrum of the great Augustus, promising pardon for all delinquencies. And, what would you? But was not the Prefect of Rome dead? The Consul Major had stated it positively to all those who asked the question of him, and he had it on the positive authority of Fulce, the Prefect's most trusted slave. It was the Consul Major who, preceded by his lictors, had caused the imperial decree to be read out aloud to the people of Rome from the topmost steps of the Temple of Mars, and it was he who had then ordered the decree to be affixed to the wall of the rostrum. The Consul Major had received the precious parchment at the hands of the special messenger sent by the Caesar himself. That messenger was none other than Fulce, and he had stated positively that the Prefect of Rome was dead. It was useless to demand that a man be proclaimed to the Principate if that man be dead. True that some of the malcontents, those young men who were hot-headed and whose raging tempers were not easily curbed, refused to accept the news, and loudly demanded the body of the hero so that divine honours might be accorded to it, to the lifelong shame of the Caesar who had so basely murdered him. But the praetor Urbanus had declared that the body of the Prefect could not be found, and the rumour had gained ground that it had been defiled and thrown to the dogs. A sullen discontent reigned amongst the people for this, and it could not be allayed by all the promises of pardon and of rejoicing which the imperial proclamation decreed. There had been some calls too for Dea Flavia. The Caesar had nominated his successor to the imperium in the circus the other day. If the Augusta would but make her choice, the people would perhaps be ready to accept her lord now as consort imperi, with the ultimate hope that a just and brave man would succeed to the Principate in due course. But no sound had as yet come from the house of Dea Flavia, and the people hung about the forum in desultory groups, discussing the situation. That the gods had intervened in the Caesar's favour no one could reasonably doubt, even whilst the anger of the populace was at its height, and dense masses had surrounded his palace to which he had been known to flee. He had been spirited away out of the city. His proclamation had come from Etruria, showing that he was already far from his city and on his way to join his legions. How did he succeed in making way for himself through the dense masses that had thronged the streets for nigh on 48 hours, since first the tumults broke out in the circus when the Prefect of Rome was stabbed? Had Jupiter sent down his thunders yesterday, his lowering clouds and heavy showers of rain, only in order to aid the Caesar in his progress? What hand had guided him down the declivities of the Palatine? What arm shielded him from the anger of the people? Dea Flavia had heard the news even as soon as the first hour of the day had been called. Yesterday, bruised in mind and heart and body, she had lain for close on an hour in a dreamless, semi-conscious state. It was only when she awoke from that the knowledge of her misery returned to her in full. She had found love, happiness, pride, all that makes life exquisite and fair, only to lose all these treasures even before she had had time to grasp them. Love had been called to life by the look, the touch of one man. Happiness had come when she saw the love light in his eyes, born in response to hers. Pride came with all the rich gifts which she could lavish upon him. Now everything was gone. He had taken everything from her, even as he gave it, and he took everything in order to offer it as a sacrifice to his God. Now her heart was numbed, and her brain tried in vain to conjure up the images of yesterday, the happy moments when she had lain against the noblest heart in Rome. but the only vision that her dulled senses could perceive was that of dying Menecreta speaking that awful curse, or of herself, Dea Flavia, gazing with eyes of anger and of pride into vacancy wherein her imagination had traced a glowing cross, and uttering words of defiance that seemed so futile, so sacrilegious now. The storm then had obscured the sky, drove the rain in heavy patter overhead. The air was dismal and dark. Now a brilliant sunshine flooded the imperial city with its radiance. The wet marble glistened in the dawn, and a roseate hue tipped the 7 hills of Rome with glory. But in Dea Flavia's heart there was only sorrow, darker than the blackest night. Sleep forsook her eyelids, and all night long she tossed about restlessly on her couch, listening to the sounds that came from the city in rebellion, counting them out as they died away one by one. She had gone to her room quite early in the day. Her guests, she knew, were being well looked after, and she could not bear to remain in the studio, whose every corner reminded her of that powerful personality which had lately filled it, and whose very walls still echoed with the sound of that rough voice, rendered at times so exquisitely tender. Blanca attended on her, and put her to bed, for she could not bear to have Licinia near her. The old woman's gossip jarred upon her nerves, and she was physically afraid to hear indifferent lips utter the name of the Prefect of Rome. Only the call, "Hail, Taurus Antinor Caesar, hail!" which still came half the night through from afar, dulled her agony of mind for a few seconds when it struck upon her ear. It set her wondering, thus allowing her momentarily to forget her misery. Then she would lie, wide-eyed, looking upwards and pondering. Who was this god whom Taurus Antinor worshipped? Who was he, and what had he done? All she knew was that he had died upon a cross, the most ignominious death mortal man could suffer, and the Prefect of Rome, the proud Roman patrician, had been content to obey him as a slave. Who was he, and what had he done? On this she pondered half the night through, while fever coursed through her veins, and her brows were moist and aching, her heart palpitating with pain. The dawn found her wearied and sick, but she rose when Blanca came to her in the first hour. She summoned Licinia and all her women and ordered them to dress her in one of her richest robes. She looked very girlish and very pale when she stood decked out in the embroidered tunic which she had chosen. It was of a soft material, clinging to her graceful figure in long straight folds. There was some elaborate embroidery around the hem, below which her feet peeped out, clothed in sandals of gilt leather. When she was dressed, she went out into the atrium, and then sent word to the praetorian prefect and his friends that she was ready to receive them. Some of the news from the busy world outside had already reached her ears. Licinia was not like to be chary in imparting to her mistress the scraps of gossip which she had collected. The Caesar was outside the city. He would in due time return to Rome at the head of his legions, and in the meanwhile he had by a comprehensive and gracious act of clemency pardoned all those who had offended against his majesty. The noble patricians who yesterday had already deposed him, and had called on her to name his successor, had been foiled in their ambitious schemes by the very man whom she, Dea Flavia, would have set upon the throne. And once more that one all-absorbing puzzle confronted her. Who and what was this god who had exacted this all-embracing sacrifice? She wandered somewhat aimlessly through the halls, for the great lords were not yet ready to appear before her, and as she crossed the atrium and went into the peristylium, looking with somewhat wistful longing toward the open portals of the vestibule and the vista of open air and the sky from whence the breath of pure fresh air struck pleasingly on her nostrils, she saw that in spite of the early hour a large number of the poorer clients, suppliants at the door of the great Augusta, had already assembled there. Foremost amongst them was an elderly man dressed in the plain garb of a slave, and wearing, embroidered on his tunic, the badge that proclaimed him in the service of the Prefect of Rome. The man appeared to be very insistent, and to be receiving in consequence somewhat rough treatment from the janitors. Dea Flavia turned to one of her own slaves and ordered the man to be brought to her presence in the studio, where she would receive him. The man told the janitors that his name was Folce, that he belonged to the Prefect of Rome and desired speech with the Augusta. He walked in very humbly, with back bent nearly double, and when he was shown into the studio where the Augusta sat alone, he fell on both knees before her. "Thy name is Folce, I am told," she began graciously. "And thou art of the household of the praefect of Rome?" "I attend upon his person, gracious lady," replied the man. "And thou hast brought me a message from him?" she asked, even as with this hope her heart began to beat violently in her breast. "Not from him, gracious lady," said Folces humbly, "for the praefect of Rome is dead." "Who told thee that he was dead?" she asked. "Taurus Antinor named Anglicanus," replied the man simply. "He sent me my freedom this night, and a message to lay at the feet of Dea Flavia Augusta." "Give me the message," she said. Still on his knees, Folces fumbled in the folds of his mantle, and from his breast he drew a roll of parchment which he offered to the Augusta. "Rise, Folces, and go while I read," she said. "Wait outside the door till I do summon thee." She waited until the man had closed the heavy door behind him. She wanted to be alone with these last words which he had penned for her. Now she untied the string that held the roll together, then she unfolded the parchment and read: "Idol of my soul, beloved of my heart, aroused from dreams of thee, my wakening soul takes its last flight to thy feet. This is farewell, my dear, dear heart. Even as my hand pens the word, the dawn around me turns to the likeness of the night, and it is peopled with all the sorrows that wear out the heartstrings, slowly, one by one. The Caesar is safe. Even as I write, he starts forth on his way to join his legions. Having left him in charge of those who do not know how to betray, I succeeded in the night in reaching the detachment of the Praetorian Guard encamped around the circus. A small company of them returned with me to the lonely house in the Aventine, and from thence at break of day they started with the Caesar toward Etruria, where the legions home from the expedition against the Alemanni were still known to abide. In 3 or 4 days, or mayhap 5, the Caesar will re-enter his city. His proclamation of pardon is so worded that his keeping of his word is closely bound up both with his honour and his personal safety. The people therefore have naught to fear from his vengeance. Those who have more actively conspired against him, and who would have drawn thee in their selfish schemes, have time before them to put themselves and their belongings out of the immediate reach of the Caesar. Tell them to live in retirement, as far from Rome as they can, until such time as the events of the past few days have been erased from the tablets of memory. The Caesar is safe, and I, dear heart, do bid thee a last farewell. When I parted from thee yesterday, we both knew then that the parting would be for ever. Even though thine exquisite hands clung to me and twined themselves round the very fibres of my soul, and thy voice called me back with the ineffable sweetness of thy love, I knew that it would be for ever. The Caesar will never forgive me that I witnessed his abject humiliation, and even at dawn, when he stood surrounded by his Praetorian Guard, as secure from danger as human agency could make him, a gleam of hatred shone in his eyes whenever he looked on me. He never would give thee to me, dear heart, and would vent his wrath also upon thy dear head. 'Tis better that he too should think me dead, for dead will I be to Rome, and to the people among whom my name might yet give cause for strife and for discontent. The Caesar is safe, and I can go my ways in peace. He hath no longer need of me, but my Lord hath called, and I his servant must take up my cross and follow him. The priceless gifts which thy pure hands did hold out to me are registered in his book of heaven, and he never forgets. As for me, I were less or more than a man were I to ask thee to forget. I would have thee remember. Yet would I think of thee as happy and radiant as the stars wherewith he hath gladdened the darkness of our nights. But think not of me as unhappy. My Lord hath called, and I the servant am bound to follow. He laid a burden on me, and this burden must I bear, even though I may bear with it all the pain that is greater than the pain of the earth, greater than the ceaseless travail of the sea, even though I may bear with it that bitterest of all bitter fruits, the labour that is nothing worth. That I know not. Who knoweth? O God, truly not I. There was grief in the world, dear heart, even before the stars were made, or the sky stretched its blue dome above. and as hour follows hour, day succeeds day, and the cycles of years come and go, even so do fresh griefs and greener sorrows spring around us. Like each recurrent season, they too come and go. Only one thing abideth, dear heart, and that is the will of God, who made happiness and woe, love and pain, sleep and death. And 'tis the will of God that I should lose thee and yet continue to live, even though life to me henceforth will be one long dream of death. Idol of my soul, beloved of my heart, farewell. I go to find comfort from that bitter word, on the summit of Golgotha, at the foot of an abandoned broken cross. When my soul hath found peace, then will it be ready for the service of God. Farewell, my beloved. May God have thee in his keeping, even as thy soul hath already been touched with his grace. Farewell. Mine eyes are dim, my hand trembles, hot tears blur the writing on this parchment, and as I look up through the open doorway, to where the limitless horizon lies beyond Rome's 7 hills, I see stretched out before me the long vista of years, throughout which my heart will be forever weaving with threads of longing and of sorrow the tether which binds undying memory to thee. Her hands, which held the roll of parchment, dropped down upon her lap. Her eyes too were dim, and the hot tears fell from them one by one. A sadness that was in no way bitter, and yet was immeasurable as death, had filled her entire being as she read. Slowly she laid the parchment in the bosom of her tunic. Then, like one who walks in sleep, she rose and crossed the studio. Her hand, white and slightly quivering, pushed back the heavy door that masked the inner room. Silently it swung upon its hinges, disclosing the sanctum where yesterday the stricken hero had lain helpless and sick. The couch had not been touched since he had laid on it. It still bore the imprint of the massive figure as it lay inert in the embrace of drugged sleep. The pillow only had been smoothed out as if by a loving hand, and as Dea Flavia came nearer to it, she saw that a small object had been laid there, as if reverently, right in the centre. The tears in her eyes obscured her vision momentarily, but when they fell one by one down her cheeks, she saw a little more clearly, and having approached the couch, she took up the small object that lay there upon the pillow. It was the wooden cross which she had last seen held between the clasped hands of the man whom she loved. She gazed on the small symbol, and gazed, even though the tears gathered thick and fast in her eyes, and the image that she saw was scarce discernible as it rested in her hand. How puzzled had she been 2 nights ago when she stole softly into this room and saw him kneeling here beside the couch, clasping this wooden symbol between his fingers, intertwined in a gesture of passionate prayer. She had been puzzled because his actions of the day before had seemed incomprehensible to her. His attitude to my lord Hortensius Martius, an enemy whose life he had saved at risk of his own, his loyalty to the Caesar whom everyone abhorred. All this had puzzled her then, but how infinitely more profound was that puzzle now. A riddle more mysterious than any sage could propound lay hidden in the words of the letter which she had just read. The man who had penned that letter had poured out his heart in it, and it was not a heart that was void of pity or of love. It brimmed over with pity, it was bruised with the intensity of love, but, crushed and broken though it was, it did not murmur, it only endured. Dea Flavia looked down upon the small object which to Taurus Antinor had been an emblem of that God whom he worshipped, and who had been man and had died a shameful death. Who was this God whom Taurus Antinor worshipped, for whose sake and at whose bidding he was content to give up all the super heights of ambition to which a Roman patrician could aspire? Who was this God, and what had he done that a man like Taurus Antinor, a man filled with all a man's strength and all a man's heroism, a man worshipped of the people and glorified by an entire nation, should thus give up the lordship of Rome in order to do him service? That he should give it up too, without a murmur, content to offer this final and absolute sacrifice. Think not of me as unhappy. My Lord has called me, and I, his servant, am bound to follow. Thus had the man written in loneliness and in peace after the sacrifice had been accomplished, even after she, the Augusta, had, with love-filled heart and generous hands, offered him everything that man could desire on this earth. He had written it in loneliness and in peace, having given up the world to follow his God. Who was this God, and what had he done that his power over Taurus Antinor's heart was greater than her own? Yesterday she had cursed him loudly and called him cruel and unjust. 4 days ago she had defied him, and now he had conquered. Taurus Antinor had obeyed him, and she who loved him and whom he loved was left desolate. For this she never doubted. He loved her, that she knew. She was no child now. The last 4 days had made a woman of her. In the past 4 days she had tasted of and witnessed every passion that rends a human heart. Love, ambition, cruelty, hatred. She had seen them all. Seen through passion men brought down to a level lower than the beasts, and through passion a man become equal to a god. No, she was no longer a child, she was a woman now, and there was much that, if she did not understand, she at least could not doubt. The man whom she loved her with an intensity at least equal to that which even now made her heart throb at the memory of his kiss. He loved her, longed for her, would have laid down his life for her even at the moment when he tore himself away from her arms. He loved her and longed for her, even whilst his trembling fingers penned this last impassioned farewell. He loved her, and he loved Rome, but his God called to him, and he, the proud Roman patrician, the accepted lord of the Augusta and of Rome, followed as would a slave. Slowly she dropped down on her knees, just where he too had knelt 2 nights ago, and like unto him she clasped her hands together, scarce conscious that the tiny wooden cross still lay between her fingers. "Thou hast conquered, O Galilean," she murmured, whilst great sobs that would not be suppressed rose to her throat. "At thy call he left everything that makes life beautiful and happy. At thy call he left me to mourn. He left the people of Rome who acclaimed him. He left the throne of Augustus and the empire of the world. Everything he left at thy call. What hast thou in thy nail-pierced hands to give him in return?" For a while now she was able to give way to her immeasurable sorrow. Her head buried in the pillow whereon his head had rested, she sobbed out her loving, aching heart in a passionate fit of weeping. Just like the Christian yesterday up on the heights, so was she, the pagan, alone now with her grief. More lonely than he, she had no anchorage, and in her ear had never sounded those all-compelling words, sublime in their perfect gentleness, "Come unto me." But who shall tell what divine hand soothed her burning forehead, what divine words of comfort was whispered in her ear? Gradually her tears ceased to flow, the heavy sobs were stilled, her aching and bruised body felt numb with the pain in her heart, but outwardly she was more calm. She rose from her knees, and hiding the small cross in the bosom of her gown, she drew forth the letter and read it through once more. "If only I knew," she murmured, "if only I could understand." After a while she bethought her of the slave Fulce, the one human link left now between herself and the man whom she loved and who was gone from her. With reverent hand she smoothed out the couch, the pillow which had supported his head, the coverlet which had lain over him. She was loth to go from this room whose every corner seemed still to hold something of his personality, and whose every wall seemed to hold an echo of his voice. She would have stayed here for hours longer, talking to that absent personality, powerful and mysterious more than ever now, listening to the rugged voice which she would never hear again. But there was something that she must do ere she gave herself over finally to her dreams. There was a duty to accomplish which she knew he would ask of her. Therefore, after a last, long, all-embracing look on the place which would forever be as a sanctuary in her sight, she went back to the studio at last, and herself going to the door, she called Fulce back to her. "The Prefect of Rome, good Fulce," she asked as soon as the man had entered. "Wilt see him again?" "Taurus Antinor, named Anglicanus, hath left Rome today on his way to Syria, O Augusta," said the man, humbly insisting on the name of his master. "Dost not go with him?" "He hath commanded me to stay here, and to look after his household until such time as he doth direct." "His household?" she said. I had not thought of that. What is to become of his house in Rome, his villa at Ostia, and his slaves?" "The Prefect of Rome," said Folces, "made ere he died a testament wherein he did command the freedom of all his slaves, and ordered a certain sum of money to be set aside, which will enable even the humblest amongst us all to live decently like freedmen. The house in Rome and the villa at Ostia are to be sold, whilst the remainder of Taurus Antinor's private fortune is to be administered by his general agents. He said that he would see to it later on. I am still his slave. He did not confide in me." "Yet he asked thee to look after his household." "It will take a little time until the manumissio testamento can take effect. In the meanwhile we are all Taurus Antinor's slaves, and must look after his houses until they have been sold." "Wilt be happy as a freedman, Folces?" "Yes, Augusta," replied the man simply, "for then I shall be at liberty to follow Taurus Antinor as his servant." She sat quite silently after this, her tear-stained eyes fixed into vacancy. Folces was on his knees, waiting to be dismissed. It was some little while before she remembered his presence. Then in a gentle voice she bade him go. "Should I take a message back to my master?" he said humbly. "I could find him, I think, if I had a message." "I have no message," she said. "Go, good Folces." End of chapter 34.
Chapter 35 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Thomas. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 35. Quote, "We are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do." End quote. Luke chapter 17 verse 10. Half an hour later, Dea Flavia Augusta was in the tablinum. She had received Caius Nepos, the Praetorian prefect, Marcus Ancyrus the elder, my lords Hortensius Martius, Philippus Decius, and the others, and they, who had heard so many conflicting rumours throughout the morning, and were beginning to quake with fear, for none of the rumours were reassuring, were grouped, trembling and expectant, around her. "My lords," she began, as soon as she had received their obsequious greetings, "I know not if you have heard the news. The Caesar hath succeeded in quitting Rome. He is on his way to rejoin his legions, and nothing can stand in the way of his progress. In a few days from now he will make his state re-entry into the city, and the city will resound from end to end with rejoicings in his honour." "We had all heard the news, Augusta," said Caius Nepos, who was vainly trying to steady his voice and to appear calm and dignified. "And also that a proclamation of pardon hath preceded the entry of the Caesar into Rome, and hath been affixed to the rostrum of the great Augustus by the consul major himself this morning." "And what do you make of all this, my lords?" she asked. "That some gods of evil have been at work," muttered young Escanes between set teeth, "and spirited the tyrannical madman out of the way for the further scourging of his people." "The spirit, my lords," she interposed quietly, "that led my kinsman to safety last night was one which actuated the noblest patrician in Rome to do his duty loyally by the Caesar." "Then curse him for a traitor," muttered Caius Nepos, whose cheeks had become white with terror. "He was no traitor to you, my lords," she retorted hotly, "for he was not one of you. He was true to the oath which he had rendered to the Caesar, aye, even to the Caesar whom we, my lords, all of us here present, had been ready to betray." Then, as she saw nothing but sullen faces around her, and not a word broke the silence that ensued, she continued more calmly. "Yesterday you came to me, my lords, with proposals of treachery, to which I, alas, did listen, because in my heart I had already chosen one man who I felt was worthy to rule over this great empire. I had made my choice, and myself offered him the imperium, the throne of Augustus, and the sceptre of the Caesars. But he refused it all, my lords, and went forth in the night to place himself body and heart at the Caesar's service." "And his name, O Augusta?" queried Ancyrus the elder. "He hath name Taurus Antinor, and was once prefect of Rome." "He is dead," broke in Hortensius Martius hotly. "He lived long enough, my lord," she retorted, to show us all our duty." There was silence after that, for many a heart was beating spasmodically with fear or with hope. My Lord Hortensius Martius sat on a low stool, with his elbow on his knee, his chin buried in his hand. His eyes, glowing with dull and sullen hatred, searched the face of Dea Flavia, trying to read what went on behind the pure, straight brow and those liquid blue eyes, deep as the fathomless sea. "What is to be done?" said Ancyrus the elder, with a pitiable look of perplexity directed at the Augusta. "To make our submission to the Caesar," she said simply. "Those of us, at least, who are not afraid of his wrath. For the others there is still time to seek a safe retreat far away from Rome." "But this is monstrous!" cried Hortensius Martius, suddenly jumping to his feet, and beginning to pace up and down the room in an outburst of impotent wrath. "This is miserable, cowardly, abject. What? Would ye allow that stranger, that son of slaves, to thwart your plans by his treachery? Are we naughty children that can thus be sent, well whipped and whining, to bed? Up, my lords, this is not the end. Caesar is not yet in Rome. The people are still dissatisfied. Hark to the noise in the forum below. Does it sound as if the populace was accepting the news with rejoicing? Up now, my lords, it is not too late. Acclaim your new Caesar. It is not too late, I say. When the legions return with that mountebank at their head, let them find Dea Flavia Augusta and her lord the acknowledged masters of Rome." He looked flushed, excited and proud, feeling that even at this 11th hour he could carry these men along with him if Dea Flavia put the weight of her power on his side. Now he paused in his peroration, standing above his fellow conspirators as if already he were their ruler, and looking from one face to the other with eager, restless eyes that expressed all his enthusiasm and all his hopes. But the two older men had evidently no stomach for the situation as it now was. It had been easy matter enough to murder the Caesar treacherously, and while his legions were 3 days' march away. But now everything was very different, the issues very doubtful. No doubt that a safe retreat away from the city would be by far the wiser course. Caius Nepos, with vivid recollections of his last interview with the Caesar, shook his head with slow determination. Ancyrus the elder was silent, and only the 3 younger men had followed Hortensius Martius in his heated argument. "What sayest thou, Augusta?" asked Philippius Decius at last, looking doubtfully upon the young girl. "That ye must make your plans without me, my lords," she said coldly. "Since, as you say, the prefect of Rome is dead, I can make no choice worthy of him who is gone. I choose to return to mine allegiance, my loyalty to the Caesar and to my house." "If the Caesar returns," urged Hortensius Martius, "he will vent some of his wrath on thee." "Then I will suffer for my treachery, my lords," she rejoined proudly, "in accordance with my deserts." "But Augusta—" "I pray you, my lord," she interposed haughtily, "do not prolong your arguments. My mind is made up, and you value your own safety in the future, 'twere wiser to make preparations for a lengthy stay away from Rome." "Hadst thou listened to us yesterday," sighed Ancyrus the elder. "A heavy crime had lain against us all," she said. "Be thankful, my lords, that in the history of Rome, when it comes to be written, your deed will not have sullied the page that marks today. And now, my lords, I bid you farewell. You are in no danger if you leave the city forthwith. The rejoicings at the entry of the Caesar and the homecoming of his legions will last many days. During that time your names will be erased from the tablets of my kinsman's memory." "The gods grant it," murmured Caius Nepos. "But thou, Augusta, what of thee?" "I, my lords," she said with a gentle smile, the irony of which was lost in their self-centered intellects, "I pray have no thoughts of me. I have been placed in the keeping of one who, I am told, is mightier than Caesar. There I must be safe. So farewell, my lords. We meet again, I hope, in happier and more peaceful times." She stood up, and one by one, for was she not still the Augusta and the favourite kinswoman of the Caesar, they bent the knee before her and kissed the hem of her gown, after which act of homage they retired with backs bent and walking backwards out of the room. My lord Hortensius Martius was the last to take his leave. He went down on both knees, and would have encircled the Augusta with his arms, only she drew back quickly a step or two. "Dea, in the name of my love for thee," he began, but she interrupted him gently yet firmly. "Speak not to me of love, my lord," she said. "'Tis but love's ghost that moves to and fro when you speak." Then, as he would have protested, She put up her hand with a gesture of finality. "It is no use, my lord. What love there is in me, that you never could have aroused, not even in the past. I entreat you not to insist. Love cannot be compelled. It is or is not. Whence it comes we know not. Mayhap the gods do know. Mayhap there is only one who knows. And he seems to give much, but also to take all. Therefore mayhap love comes from him, and when we are not prepared to give up all for love's sake, then doth he withhold the supreme gift, and leave our hearts barren. Mayhap, mayhap." She sighed. "Ah, alas, I know not. And you, good my lord, do not look so puzzled and so scared. I bid you farewell now. I'll not forget you. To remember is so much easier than to love." He had perforce to accept his dismissal. He felt rebellious against fate, and would have liked to have forced her will. But as she stood there before him, clad all in white, so young and so chaste, and yet a woman who knew what love was, an awed reverence for her crept into his heart, and he felt that indeed he would never dare to speak again to her of love. He too kissed the hem of her tunic now, just as the others had done, and just as they had done, he walked out of her presence backwards, with back bent and an overwhelming disappointment in his heart. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Thomas. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 36. Quote, "The peace of God, which passeth all understanding." End quote. Philippians chapter 4 verse 7. 3 months had gone by since then. Rome had acclaimed the Caesar and rejoiced over his homecoming. There were holidays and spectacles, chariot races and gladiatorial combats, and the people of Rome forgot that it had ever shouted, "Hail, Taurus Antinor Caesar, hail!" Now the calls were for Caius Julius Caesar Caligula, and those who had most loudly shouted for his death cringed most obsequiously at his feet. The very name of the ex-prefect of Rome was already forgotten. His testament, made, it appears, just before his death, had been copiously commented on at first. All his slaves had received their freedom, together with a sufficient sum to enable one and all to live in comfort in the new state of freedom. The rest of the vast property owned by the late prefect was being somewhat mysteriously administered, and up to this hour no one had been able to gain any definite information with regard to its ultimate destination. There were those who averred that a great deal of ready money, including the proceeds of the sale of the late prefect's house in Rome and of his villa at Ostia, had found its way to a section of very poor freedmen who lived on the Aventine, and who formed a somewhat isolated little colony not viewed altogether kindly by the official magistracy of the city. But all that was mere gossip, and did not withstand the test of time. After 3 months, people had plenty of other matters to think of and to talk about. There were the festivals and games which had accompanied the re-entry of the Caesar into Rome. The city had been beflagged and adorned with banners and with garlands. For 30 days did the rejoicings last, and brilliant sunshine shone over the golden glories of autumn, and kissed the foliage of oleanders until they blushed a brilliant crimson, and tinged the marble of palaces and temples every morning with rose. The games in the great circus went on without intermission for 30 days. There were military and naval pageants, combats between the lions from Numidia and the new hyenas and crocodiles. There were gladiatorial contests and chariot races. Much human blood was shed for the delectation of the masters of the world. Much skill displayed, much prowess vanquished by prowess greater, much valour laid to dust. But the Caesar's pet black panther did not appear again in the circus. The mighty fist of the dead prefect had mayhap laid the creature low. In any case, it were not safe to reawaken dormant memories. And Caius Julius Caesar Caligula, the father of his armies, the best and greatest of Caesars, showed himself at all these pageants more crazed than ever. He hardly ever spoke now to the people. 'Twas averred that Caesonia, his wife, had given him a potion to cure him of his infatuation for Dea Flavia, his kinswoman, whom he had exalted above all other Augustas, and whose absence from Rome and from all festivities had rendered him half distracted with wrath. He would have liked to vent that wrath on Dea, but he could not lay hands on her. She had left her palace even before his re-entry into Rome, taking none but 2 of her most trusted slaves with her. The others did not know whither she had gone. Some thought that she had gone on a journey to a villa which she possessed in Sicilia. Others thought that she was living a life of retirement in a lonely dwelling on the Sabine hills, preparatory to devoting her virginity to the glory of Vesta. Caius Julius Caesar Caligula prepared to have her sought for throughout the length and breadth of his empire, and would no doubt have succeeded in time in this search, had not a few months later Chaerea, the Praetorian tribune, done the work with his hands which the dagger of young Escanes had failed to do. The winter had been slow in coming, but it had come at last. An icy wind blew from across the sea. Overhead, the sky was the colour of lead, and great banks of clouds chased one another wantonly above the hills that tower over Jerusalem. There was hardly a path up the rugged incline. The rains and winds and snows of the past 7 years had obliterated the marks which a surging crowd had once made in the wake of the sacred feet. It was close on the 9th hour, and the shadows of evening were already drawing in very fast. A tall figure dressed in sombre garments walked slowly up the hill which is called Calvary. His head was uncovered, and he had no wand wherewith to ease his footsteps. The blustering gusts of wind blew the tawny hair over his brow. He held his head erect, and his eyes did not watch the places where trod his feet. They were fixed on ahead, up toward the summit of the hill, there where a cross stood broken and lonely, with wooden arms outstretched and the birds of heaven circling all round it. Every day for 7 days now had the pilgrim wandered up the steep, desolate hill. Every day for 7 days he had reached the summit ere the 9th hour was called from the city walls. He lived at a small inn just inside the 3rd wall, and every day at noon he set out on his pilgrimage, and only came home when the darkness of night lay dense upon the valley. Today he was more weary than he had ever been before. His feet felt like leaden weights that seemed to be dragging him down and ever downwards, and the loneliness of the place had its image within his heart. On the summit he fell on his knees, and knelt at the foot of the cross, leaning his aching forehead against the cold, dank wood. "How long, oh my God, how long?" he murmured. "The misery is more than I can bear. I am ready to do thy work, O God, to speak thy word where thou dost bid me go. But take her image, dear Lord, from before mine eyes. It stands for ever twixt thy cross and me. Break my heart, O God, since her image fills it, and its every beat is not in thy name. Take the cup from me, dear Lord. It is too bitter, and I cannot drink." The night drew in around him. The lights in the city below were extinguished one by one. The croaking birds on the lonely cross had found a home far away in the gloom. The pilgrim knelt against the cross. He could hardly see the objects nearest to him, the small prickly shrubs, the rough grass, the loose stones that looked so white and spectral in the waning light. He could hardly see, for his eyes ached with the dull misery of tears that would not fall. But suddenly a sound softer than that made by a night bird in its flight struck upon his ear. It was like the drawing of a garment upon the rugged ground. 1 or 2 small stones detached themselves from their bed of wet earth and rolled away from under the tread of feet that walked upwards towards the summit. The pilgrim did not move, and yet he heard the sound. It came nearer to him, and nearer. And suddenly he was not alone. Something living and warm knelt on the stony ground beside him, and gentle fingers that had the softness and the coolness of snow were laid upon his burning hands. "I came as quickly as I could," said a tender voice close to his ear, "but it has taken me some time to find thee. Had it not been for Falses and his devotion, I might mayhap never have found thee. We came to Jerusalem yesterday. Today at noon I saw thee starting forth from out the city. I followed thee, but the way was rough. I feared I should never reach the summit, and yet 'twas here I wished to speak to thee." All this while he had remained numb and silent. He knew even when first her hand touched his that God had ended his sorrow and taken his aching soul into his keeping at last. But for the moment he thought that sweet death had kissed his eyelids and that this was the first taste of paradise. Darkness was closing in around them both. He could scarcely distinguish her features, but it seemed to him as if glory shone out of her eyes, glory so radiant that it illuminated the darkness and pierced the walls of the night. "Is it thou?" he murmured. "O God, have pity on me. Her image, her sweet image, allow it to fade from my mind ere my brain becomes a traitor to thee. 'Tis not a vision, dear heart, she whispered softly. 'Tis not a dream. It is I, Dea Flavia, whom thou didst call the beloved of thy heart. I came because I loved thee, and because here on this spot I would learn from thee the mysteries of thy God. Is it thou? And hast thou come to me from heaven? No, dear heart, only from far off Rome. And I have come to thee, to be with thee, and to follow thee wherever thou wilt lead me. Yet will my wanderings lead me far, he said. My Lord has called, and I must go. Then I will go with thee, she said. To far-off lands, dear heart, to speak the word of God to those who heard it not. I will go with thee, she reiterated simply. To far-off lands whence I came, a sea-girt land which was once mine own. My fathers lived there. I would go back and tell my people of all that I saw here on Calvary 7 years ago. Then thither will I go with thee, she replied. Thy home will be my home, thy people my people, and thy God shall be my God, for thine am I now and always. I am ignorant yet, but this I do know, that thy God must be the great, the true and only God. None other God but he could have put in thy heart the strength of sacrifice which hath brought thee, who had Rome at thy feet, a lonely wanderer to the foot of this cross. She knelt beside him, and he no longer cowered. Limitless joy was in his heart, and immeasurable gratitude. For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and then he shall reward every man according to his works. The wings of the wind brought the sacred words to his ears. He kissed the rough wooden cross, there where the divine feet had rested, and Dea Flavia pressed her lips on it too, and the peace that passeth all understanding descended upon them both. Overhead the clouds had parted, their silver lining showed clearly against the dull blue sky, and in the midst of that rent in the firmament, far away in the limitless beyond, a star shone out bright and clear. Then they both rose, and hand in hand they walked slowly down the hill. The end. End of chapter 36. End of Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy.